This is the LarryInFishers.com podcast. My name is Larry Lannon, and I'm quite honored to have a guest with me. My first transatlantic podcast I've ever done. I know mostly do local podcasts here in Fishers, but I'm honored to have Natasha Bowen with me. She's the author of Skin of the Sea, a great fiction book. Natasha, thank you so much for taking time out to speak with me today.
No, thanks for having me. And I feel special being your first transatlantic.
Okay. Well, you are special in many ways. That's just one. I also have I also have Erin Ware with me. Erin is with the Hamilton East Library. She's here to talk about the Books Build Bridges event coming up Saturday, September 30th. Is in the afternoon, 2:30 until 4:30. It's going to be held at the Forum Event Center. Natasha Bowen will be one of the speakers there. So, Erin, we'll bring you in a little later to talk more detail about that. But thank you for joining me as well.
Thanks, Larry.
So let's get started. I'm going to, of course, begin talking to the author, Natasha Bowen. One thing that fascinated me is your background. Your parents are Nigerian and Welsh, and you live, of course, in the United Kingdom. You're a parent yourself now. But I always like to talk to authors. I like to ask about what sparked your interest in writing. And normally it starts when you begin reading at a young age and then become interested in writing. Talk a little bit about how Natasha Bowen became a writer.
Well, I love books, and I think I started reading when I was about 3 or 4. Um, my mum's dyslexic, so at that age she started. When I was that age, she started to skip over certain words, and I would sound them out instead. And I don't think we had a TV at that point as well, so it was literally books or or playing outside. And I just read a lot, bought books from church sales. And then we have two different types of school: primary from 4 to 11, and then secondary from 11 to 16. And when I went to secondary school, I was still enjoying reading. I was still loving it. Apart from the books on the syllabus were not as exciting as, I think at that point I was reading Stephen King, because I don't think YA existed back then. It was either you went from Judy Blume to Flowers in the Attic, or at least I did. And I used to get my work done very quickly at school, and I used to read behind my textbooks. And I used it as a way. It was not just entertainment, it was a way to escape. And I wanted to be able to do that. I want to be able to do that. I wanted to be able to create worlds and stories and characters that people would just lose themselves in. And so I think the first little booklet or story I wrote, I was about 6. And I think I'd stapled together these little pages to make this book, and had illustrated it as well. Probably wasn't very good, but my mum told me it was amazing. And then I just carried on writing from then. I studied English at A level, so that's 16 to 18 in England. And then I went to university and did an English and creative writing course. And then I got a job in the city working in a corporate company before I had children, and didn't write for a couple of years because of that. But it was always there. I'd write little bits here and there. And I didn't really see a way into publishing. I didn't know anyone that worked in publishing. I was quite interested in it, but at that point it was very hard. Probably globally as well. Definitely here you had to do like an unpaid internship, and I couldn't afford to do that. I just carried on reading and enjoying, and then I think I took the pressure off myself and just wanted to write a story that I enjoyed, rather than a story that I thought would sell or would get me an agent. In the end, I just thought, I'm just going to write the book that I would like to read, because I've read so many books, and if I don't enjoy it, how can I work? Because you're often working on a book for years and years. If you're not enjoying it and you're doing it just for someone else, it's just not going to work. So I ended up writing the book that I wanted to read. And from the very beginning, just really loved it, and wasn't focused at all at that point on anything happening with it, not even getting an agent. I was just like, I'm just going to write this book because it's amazing and I haven't read anything like it. So that was that. And that was probably the second book that I'd finished writing, actually. I'd written a book before that, but hadn't done anything with it.
Well, I mean, obviously, other people thought this was a good book as well. You made the New York Times bestseller list. But I do want to ask this. I'm sorry I have to ask this question from what you just said. Just how old were you when you began reading Stephen King?
11. We were like 11 with
My
Pet
good,
Cemetery. Yeah, Pet Cemetery. I think I was 10 or 11. I
my
have a
good.
thing for horror films. So yeah, I would Richard Lehman, Sean Hudson, all of those like 90s horror writers. I love them. I was obsessed.
Well, but my wife would love talking to each other because she's a lover of that genre as well. So I have read your book, Skin of the Sea. That's the New York Times bestseller. You paint a very fascinating fictional picture of a spirit world in the 15th century, the 1400s. It was really related to the start of the Portuguese slave trade that was going on at that time in Western Africa. Now, the story revolves around what we would call a mermaid. But what I found fascinating is mermaid was on the cover of your book. But if you read the text of your book, you never use the word mermaid. You use another word. I'll let you talk about that. But how did you tap into those African stories and traditions related to what was happening on the African continent at that time?
I think there were some, stories that I heard growing up. There was a lot of research that I'd done myself on African history as well, and different myths that I hadn't heard of. Um, in English education, we did learn about the slave trade, but we learned about the economics of it and how great our empire was. And so I did my own research and own learning. And I'd come across Mami Wata before, and that's a name for kind of like a water spirit. It has different meanings depending on who you're speaking to. But in Skin of the Sea, I've used it instead of using the word mermaid, just like I don't use the word slaver or slave trader. It's Oyibo, which is it means foreigner in Nigeria, because I didn't want it to be a focus on. First of all, I wanted to have a different representation and then obviously a different name for mermaids, so it's not the bog standard Eurocentric one. And also I didn't really want to focus it, although it's rooted, it's in the context of the beginning of the slave trade. I didn't want the slave trade to be the entire focus. So I think by using different language and using language that's original to that culture rather than westernizing it, kept the themes of the stories true.
Yes, I would say that was exactly what you succeeded in doing. Now, you do mention in your author's notes at the end of the book that the story, The Little Mermaid, was one that made an impression on you. Explain how that story impacted The Skin of the Sea.
I love mermaids and I love magic and fairies and monsters as well, not just like, yeah. Um, and I remember reading that book and I remember having different versions. I had the audio version as well, with like, the little audio with the Walkman. So you're listening to people read the Ladybird version. And then as I grew older as well, I read how Hans Christian Andersen, like many European young men at that time, had toured around the world and had toured North Africa. And I kind of thought to myself, what about if he'd actually come across stories of water spirits in North Africa? And that inspired him. So even though the book is a spin on The Little Mermaid in some respects, I wouldn't say it's an actual retelling. I think the similarities are that she saves a boy. I think the similarities are that she changes from a mermaid to a human. But in my story, she doesn't give up her legs for a boy. And the focus is on romantic love and and trying to reach that. And while I love The Little Mermaid, it would be, I just think it's amazing to have stories of mermaids that originate in different cultures, because just having the same type of stories over and over again can get quite boring. In terms of I love completely original stories. So one of my favorite books recently was Iron Widow, which is just completely blew my mind. So I think I wanted to, while I love mermaids and magic, I wanted to tell it in a different way, in a way that I recognized and loved. And I wanted to see the representation of Black mermaids in fiction, actually, because the books that I was aware of were some picture books and a few middle grade, and there wasn't anything that at that point that I felt that married the two together, the kind of the context of what was happening in West Africa at that time and the beliefs of water spirits that existed and that were translated across the diaspora.
Yeah, you have you mentioned that you love mermaids, you love monsters as well, and you have some monstrous characters in this book. I will tell you, there are some scenes of violence. This is definitely for young adults, not for small children. But there are characters that you introduce to us that do not end up well in the end. Some do, some do not, and there's a lot in between. Uh, Here's my question to you as an author. That must be a tough decision, how to handle these characters that you introduce to us, you let us get to know them as readers, and then they don't all end up well at the end, dealing with these monstrous characters. Tell me how, as an author, how you work with that whole concept.
I tend to be a little bit vicious actually as a and I won't you've been very clever at not revealing what happens in the book. But yeah, there've been quite a few people that have been upset with me about that particular character. But I think it shows as well, it's another example of that the love and family that they've built together as a group of characters in the reason and why that happens. And even Eshu as the main antagonist is not one of the things that I had to be careful not to misrepresent was Eshu is an Orisha, and he's often portrayed as the devil in the West, and he's not. He's more of a trickster. So in Skin of the Sea, you will see how, at first you think he's evil and he's doing this, but you'll see the reasons why he's doing it. A bit like Magneto actually in X-Men. The bizarre reasons that warp them and why they're pushed to, and how they use their power in a a not so good way. But I think it's if you're making a dramatic impact, I think you tend to kill the characters that people love the most. But that could be different for each person. So I think I did definitely do that because I knew it hurt me to do it. And so I thought it would hurt readers. And that sounds quite bad. I didn't do it to be mean, but I think it's a necessary part of one of the themes of the book, which is love and sacrifice. And so, yeah, part mean, part it works with the themes.
Yeah, Ishu is definitely the evil character, but I think you do something very interesting. A lot of very good authors do. The evil character is not totally evil. Ishu's like, okay, yeah, I do this, I do that, but here's the reason why I do that, and you sort of begin to understand where he comes from, and that adds to the complexity of the story. I think. What do you think?
Yeah, it's not so black and white then, and I think when you read Soul of the Deep, you'll see not to ruin it, but there's another layer to him that's interesting in that. And yeah, because I think life is not black and white, and I think the best stories are the ones that try to describe the layers and the complexities of that in a way that readers will relate to and can understand.
Yeah, I want to ask about something you've already mentioned. And that has to do with the fact that there's the undertone of this is slavery. The evil of slavery is also a part of the story. And I don't know what it's like. You kind of related a little bit to what it's like learning about slavery in school in the United Kingdom and in the United States. Both the United Kingdom and the United States have histories with slavery. We ended slavery at different times. It took a civil war to end slavery in the United States and didn't really end until about 1865. But I guess the question I would ask you, as someone who has studied this whole issue and looked into some of this history, how do you think slavery should be taught in schools?
I think that we can only do better in the future when we learn from the past. And I think that even if the past is difficult and makes us feel uncomfortable, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be examining it. I think if you don't do that, then people can misrepresent what happens and manipulate it in different ways. And then that undermines where we are now because of what has happened. And so I think it's really important for children, and I've done this for my own children and children when I was a teacher, when the curriculum in England changes a little bit, is informing them of what happens and and it's giving children the facts so that they can try and understand, like I said, the situation that we're in now, and actually what happened, and even understanding, generational wealth in different economies, and colonization, and the way that the continent of Africa has kind of been formed because of that, and the way lots of things have been formed around the world. I think that those important things, those horrific times in history, should not be glossed over. And I think that children are intelligent enough to understand certain points, and we owe it to them to make sure that they're aware of what's actually happened.
I want to get back to the book because the main character is Simi, and she's what we would call a mermaid. You would call I think, Mami Wata. Hope I pronounced that correctly. In your book, in that tradition. Now, Simi, what I find about Simi as a character, she's always trying to do the right thing. But of course, doing the right thing doesn't, what she thinks is the right thing at the time does not always take her to a good place. And it causes some complications, and really is the thrust of the story, her trying to make good on some of what she has done in the past that she thought would be the right thing. So she has to atone for that mistake. That's where the story really goes in your book. When you construct a story like this, how do you deal with a character like Simi, who has this new role? She has memories of being a human. She has now been named to be this mermaid, Mami Wata person, but she struggles with these memories she has of her parents and of her previous life. And I find those flashbacks to be quite fascinating. Talk about how you put Simi together as a character and why you handled her the way you did.
I wanted Simi I wanted to represent the way that I think we're often, especially when we're teenagers, trying to find out who we are, being told who we are, perhaps feeling that we should be a certain way. And there's definitely a pressure, I think, when you're younger, and even as you're older, to do the right thing all the time. And the right thing can change depending on who it is telling you what the right thing is. And so I think with Simi, she's gone with her gut, but then she's also struggling, and she's trying to do the best and be the best of what she is now. But she has those memories, and she has to kind of put the two halves of herself together, and that affects the decisions that she makes in the story. I wanted to show as well that even though the consequences were quite bad for Simi, she still followed what she thought was right, and she did what she thought was right for her. And she does struggle with that, I think. And I think it shows her conscience and how she wants to look after those people that she loves and cares about, and how she wants to be perceived as well as doing the right thing. And I think, we all love being told, well done, that was exactly the right thing to do. But what happens when you're not told that, but you still thought you've done the right thing, and then you have to face the consequences and fix that? And I think that's life as well. Like, you can only make the best decisions that you have at that moment, and deal with the consequences afterwards. So I wanted to make sure that even though she's like this magical being, she's still representative of being human, and what it's like to be a teenager and a person in general who's struggling with a world that's changing, and that is quite scary.
Yeah, that's interesting because you take her teenage years. That's when this happens, when she makes this transformation from being a human to being this Mami Wata mermaid. And I think what you try to do in the book is how a teenage girl would struggle with that sort of thing. Being taken away from her family and having those memories still come back to her time and time again.
Yeah, and so much trauma that she's already endured, and then she's still going through it. And how do you cope with that? But I think it also, the way that she does it, and the way the other characters help her, and they will help each other, is that even when you're going through the worst things, they still find joy and happiness in other aspects, and that gets them through those worst things. And I think that's important to focus on, because it can often seem you know, when bad stuff is happening, that there's no way out, and that you feel, you know, what are you going to do? But I think in this story, you see her constantly shifting and pushing and trying to find the best way and trying to stay herself. It's quite tricky actually, but I'm glad that it reads like that.
You know, another theme of your book, I believe, is family. Not just Simi's, flashbacks, memories of her own parents, but there's the character I haven't really talked about him, Cola, who's the human, whom the two of them get together. I don't want to reveal too much. I want people to read the book, but they end up together on a quest to try to save not just Cola's family, who's very dear to him, but also all of humanity. It turns out, and that's what makes it a very big story. But it's all part of that same battle, saving the family, saving humanity, and I just want it begins with this whole idea of Cola being the getting together in a rather unusual way with this Mamiwata mermaid, and then how they have a common purpose as the story moves along. I'm curious how you constructed the story quite that way. I really find that fascinating and like you to talk about that.
I mean, there's aspects of romance in the book, but I didn't want it to be a complete focus on that. So I guess that's one of the main similarities with the Little Mermaid as well, how she has saved him. But so in the beginning, they don't really get on massively well, but obviously they have this shared quest, and I think through that they come to learn a lot about each other. And I wanted to explore the fact that you can have those found people in your life, perhaps friends, who become your family. And so family is not just, your biological siblings or your parents. It can be the people that become important to you in your life for different reasons. And so that's why there is romance, but the focus is on the love that like Yinka and Bem and everyone has for each other by the end of the book. So it's how that quest and how their values have brought them together and helped them to appreciate each other.
You do have that sense of family with these people who are not related by blood, because I think it goes back to Simi. They all want to do the right thing, and they're all on board with her and that entire crew. I've over the years, going back to the 1970s, off and on, have been interviewing authors of various kinds, and I've always loved that. But I want to ask you a question I found with an interview that you did recently. I think it was recently, but you told an interviewer that you wrote this book at the same time you were working as a teacher. Now, I've never been a classroom teacher. I have lots of relatives who are. I've been very close to many people who are in the teaching profession. I know how much work goes into teaching any kind of class at any level. How in the world did you write this book and teach a class at the same time?
Well, the thing is, I have 3 children as well, and at that point they were, I think they were like 6, 5. The youngest was 5 or 6, and then 13, and then 15. And it goes back to what I was saying before about writing the book that you want to read, because I loved it so much and I was so passionate about every aspect of it, from the history to the myths in it, to the spirituality, that it became an obsession. So I would write on my lunch breaks. I would also sometimes write with my class, because the writing, I think, in English classes can be very prescriptive and boring. And I wanted to show them my processes and just to get them writing. So on a Friday afternoon, we'd have like the last 20 minutes of the day, and I gave them all notebooks, and we would just write. And we're not sharing if we don't want to. And it doesn't matter what you're writing. You could be writing la la la. Usually they would write la 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 and then something else. So it's just that joy of doing it. And I just sneakily would write bits here and there, taking my son to football practice in the car, and then I would type it up at the weekends. And I think this is the thing as well, like writing a book seems such a big thing to do, but when you break it down, even if you're only writing 100 words a day, eventually you'll have a book that's finished. And I think that was the main thing for me. It's just not giving up. And I think if you're passionate about the story and you love the story, you won't give up, even if you are massively busy.
One of the great American authors, Mark Twain, once said that he would write every paragraph 5 times he wrote a book. I assume you didn't have to do that.
Well, I had to stop myself because I can be a perfectionist sometimes. So I had to, I allow myself to read something back twice, once or twice, and then I have to move on because otherwise I'll be on that first 3 chapters for like a year and think it's not good enough, but you can just come back and fix it. So, yeah, I have to force myself to carry on. Otherwise I would be stuck on chapter 3.
Let me bring in Aaron Ware of the Hamilton East Library. Natasha Bowen is one of the 3 authors set to speak on September 30th. Tell us more about what's coming up there.
We have a panel of 3 authors who each have written stories that are retellings of classics or fairy tales in some sort. So the other 2 authors are Christina Soon-Torvat, who wrote A Wish in the Dark, which is a retelling of Les Mis, but it's the children's book. And it's set in a similar to Thailand era or place. And Sonali Dave wrote the adult book that we're featuring called Pride, Prejudice, and Other Flavors, which is obviously a retelling of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. But it's set in modern day San Francisco with a family that moved from India the generation before the main characters. So we have a panel set with Natasha talking about her retelling of The Little Mermaid, Skin of the Sea, with the other 2 authors, and our moderator, Ruth Sparks, who's our maker in residence in our Ignite studio for the next couple of months. And we'll talk about how you all created your stories from an original story, but obviously in completely different directions to make something amazing. And so we've given away many copies of each of the books at the Hamilton East Public Library. I believe almost all of the copies are gone, so that's fantastic. But people who come to the event can have them signed at the end by each of the authors. So not only can they see the authors in person, but they can get their book signed too.
Very good. Natasha, I have one last question for you, because when I finished your book, I could tell, all right, this author has set this story up for a sequel. And in fact, in the copy that I have, I don't know if you did this with all the copies, but I did see you teased a little bit the first part of the next book, which is called Soul of the Deep. So can you give us just a little taste of what Soul of the Deep is all about?
So Soul of the Deep, I'm trying not to spoil it. I suppose it's an extension of Simi righting the wrongs that she's caused, but on a massive scale. This time there's consequences for them managing to topple Eshu, or what happens with Eshu at the end, and they have to face those. I think in Skin of the Sea we saw Senegalese fairies, and in Soul of the Deep we will see like the African version of the Loch Ness monster, and a Madagascan man-eating tree, which doesn't sound like it makes sense at the minute, but if you read the book, it does. There's more Mami Wata as well. I wanted to explore more of that world. So I think the first sort of quarter of it is under the sea, and then you will find out what happens with Simi and Kola and whether they have their happy ending or not.
Excellent. Aaron, anything you'd like to add before we wrap this podcast up?
No, I'm just excited to see Natasha and Christina and Sonali all talk about their books on September 30th.
So, Natasha, I've tried to ask a number of questions, but anything you would like to add as we finish up here?
No, I just think it's exciting to have a book about Black mermaids so well received, to see covers like that are becoming more and more common nowadays, like a Black mermaid with natural hair and a story that originates from West Africa. So I'm excited to come as well and speak some more.
It's great to have you coming to Fishers, Indiana. And here is your book. It is Skin of the Sea. That's the one you'll be talking about. She also spoke of her new book, which is Soul of the Deep. So, Natasha Bowen, thank you so much. Such a pleasure to speak with you today. And Aaron Ware, thank you for giving us the information about the event coming up September 30th. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.